The Arizona sun burned mercilessly overhead as Samuel wiped sweat from his brow with shackled hands. The heavy iron chains around his ankles clinked with each strike of his pickaxe against the unforgiving desert rock. Around him, dozens of other prisoners worked in silence, their backs bent under the weight of building the great railroad that would connect the territories. The guards sat in whatever shade they could find, rifles across their laps, occasionally shouting threats at anyone who dared slow their pace. Meanwhile, 300 miles away in the stone cell of Red Rock Jail, Ruby shivered against the damp walls. The small barred window offered little light and even less hope. Her once beautiful dress was now torn and stained, her dark skin bearing the marks of rough treatment. The guards brought her only stale bread and murky water once each day, laughing as they slid the meager meal through the slot. But Ruby remembered better times. She closed her eyes and saw herself as a child, running through golden wheat fields alongside Samuel on their family farm in Texas. They had been inseparable then, chasing butterflies and helping their mother tend to the chickens. Samuel had always protected her, always made her laugh when the world seemed too harsh. Those memories were all that kept her spirit alive in this terrible place. 3 months earlier, the dusty stagecoach rolled into Red Rock under the blazing afternoon sun. Ruby stepped down carefully, her simple cotton dress and bonnet marking her as a traveler from far away. She carried only a small leather suitcase and the determination burning in her heart to find her missing brother Samuel. The main street of Red Rock stretched before her like a scene from her worst nightmares. White faces turned to stare at her with undisguised hostility. Children pointed and whispered to their mothers, who quickly pulled them closer. Men in dusty work clothes and cowboy hats spat tobacco juice and muttered words she chose not to hear. Ruby walked with her head held high toward the saloon, hoping to find lodging and information. The bartender, a heavy man with graying whiskers, looked up from polishing glasses and shook his head before she could even speak. "We do not serve your kind here," he said coldly. "Try the livery stable outside town if you need somewhere to sleep." The other patrons laughed and made crude comments as Ruby turned and walked back into the harsh sunlight. Her heart pounded, but she would not let them see her fear. Samuel was somewhere in this hostile place, and she would find him no matter what these people said or did to discourage her. The next morning, Ruby found herself standing before the small wooden church at the edge of town. Father McKenna, an elderly Irish priest with kind eyes, was the only person willing to speak with her without hatred in his voice. His weathered hands trembled as he invited her inside the modest sanctuary. "Your brother," the priest said softly, his accent thick with sorrow. "I remember him well. Samuel was a good man, quiet and respectful. He came to town looking for honest work at the railroad construction site." Ruby leaned forward in the wooden pew, her heart racing. "What happened to him, Father? Where is Samuel now?" The old priest looked away, unable to meet her desperate gaze. "They accused him of stealing a prized stallion from William Stone, the wealthy rancher who owns half the territory around here. The horse was worth more money than most folks see in a lifetime." "That is impossible," Ruby whispered, her voice breaking. "Samuel would never steal anything. He has always been the most honest person I know. Even as children, he would confess to breaking dishes that I had actually broken." Father McKenna nodded sadly. The trial lasted barely an hour. Judge Webster heard only the testimony of Stone and his ranch hands. No one spoke for Samuel. No one dared. The sentence was 5 years of hard labor on the railroad construction crew. Ruby felt the world spinning around her. 5 years of brutal work under the desert sun. All for a crime her brother could never have committed. She gripped the edge of the pew until her knuckles turned pale. "There must be some mistake," she said, her voice growing stronger with determination. "I will prove his innocence. I will find the truth, no matter what it takes." The priest placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, but his eyes held little hope for justice in this unforgiving town. Ruby marched through the dusty streets of Red Rock with newfound purpose burning in her chest. The wooden buildings seemed to lean away from her as she made her way to the town hall, where Mayor James Harrison held court like a king among his subjects. Her worn boots clicked against the wooden boardwalk as curious and hostile eyes followed her every step. The mayor's office was filled with cigar smoke and the stench of corruption. Harrison, a portly man with a thick mustache and expensive suit that seemed out of place in this frontier town, looked up from his mahogany desk with obvious irritation. "What do you want here?" he demanded, not bothering to rise or offer her a seat. Ruby stood tall despite the intimidating surroundings. "I want justice for my brother Samuel. He was wrongly convicted of stealing William Stone, his horse." I demand a new investigation and a fair trial." Harrison laughed, a cold sound that echoed off the walls. "Your brother received exactly what he deserved. The law in Red Rock is final, and I suggest you accept that fact." But Ruby was not finished. She walked outside and climbed onto a wooden crate in the town square, raising her voice so everyone could hear. "My brother Samuel is innocent. He was convicted without proper evidence or witnesses for his defense. This town has denied him justice." A crowd began to gather, their faces twisted with anger and disgust. Men shouted insults and threats while women pulled their children closer, as if Ruby carried some terrible disease. Mayor Harrison appeared on the steps of the town hall, his face red with fury. "You dare to question our justice system and insult the good people of Red Rock? I warn you once, leave this town immediately, or face the consequences of your defiance." Ruby met his gaze without flinching. "I will not leave until my brother is free and the truth is revealed to everyone." The crowd's angry murmurs grew louder as Harrison, his eyes narrowed with dangerous intent. For the next 2 days, Ruby refused to be silenced. She visited every shop, every home, every gathering place in Red Rock, asking questions about the night Samuel was accused of theft. Most people slammed doors in her face or threatened to call the sheriff, but she persisted with unwavering determination. She discovered small inconsistencies in the stories told by Stone's ranch hands. One claimed to have seen Samuel near the stables at midnight, while another swore it was closer to dawn. Their descriptions of the stolen horse varied in small but important details. Ruby carefully wrote down every word in a small notebook she carried. On the third morning, Sheriff Davies appeared at the livery stable where Ruby had been sleeping. He was accompanied by 2 deputies, all wearing grim expressions and carrying heavy wooden clubs alongside their holstered revolvers. "Ruby Johnson, you are under arrest for disturbing the peace, inciting public disorder, and showing disrespect to the lawful authorities of Red Rock," Davies announced, his voice echoing through the stable. The other workers stopped their morning chores to watch as Ruby was led away in iron shackles. Her wrists burned from the tight metal bands, but she held her head high as they marched her through the main street toward the jail. Judge Webster, the same man who had condemned Samuel, presided over her brief trial that afternoon. The courtroom was packed with hostile faces, all eager to see justice served according to their twisted definition. "The defendant has clearly disrupted the peace of our community and questioned the integrity of our legal system," Webster declared from his elevated bench. "Therefore, I sentence her to 20 lashes with the bullwhip, to be administered publicly as an example to others who might consider similar acts of defiance." Ruby felt her blood turn to ice. 20 lashes could kill a person, or leave him permanently damaged. The execution was scheduled for dawn in 3 days, giving the town time to build anticipation for the spectacle. As they dragged her to the stone cell, Ruby wondered if she would live to see Samuel again. Dawn broke gray and cold over Red Rock as the entire town gathered in the central square for the public punishment. Ruby was dragged from her cell, her hands bound behind her back with rough rope that cut into her wrists. Her torn dress barely covered her shoulders, and her legs trembled from 3 days of hunger and fear. The wooden whipping post stood like a monument to cruelty in the center of the square. Mayor Harrison climbed onto a makeshift platform, his voice booming across the assembled crowd of men, women, and children who had come to witness what they called justice. "Let this be a lesson to anyone who dares question the law and order of Red Rock," Harrison shouted, gesturing toward Ruby with theatrical flourish. "Defiance and disrespect will not be tolerated in our community." The crowd cheered and jeered as Sheriff Davies forced Ruby toward the post. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. She looked up at the morning sky, thinking of Samuel somewhere far away, hoping he would forgive her for failing to save him. Just as Davies reached for the leather whip hanging from his belt, a commotion erupted at the edge of the square. A mysterious figure in a long dark coat and wide-brimmed hat had released a dozen horses from the livery stable. The animals charged through the crowd in panic, scattering people in all directions. Thick smoke suddenly filled the air as someone threw what appeared to be burning rags soaked in oil. People coughed and stumbled blindly, shouting in confusion and fear. In the chaos, Ruby felt strong hands cutting her bonds and pulling her away from the whipping post. "Come with me if you want to live," a deep voice whispered urgently in her ear. Without hesitation, Ruby followed her mysterious rescuer through the smoke and confusion, leaving behind the angry shouts of Mayor Harrison and the frustrated curses of Sheriff Davies. They disappeared into the maze of back alleys and side streets as the town descended into complete disorder behind them. Deep in the abandoned silver mine outside Red Rock, Ruby finally caught her breath and got her first clear look at her rescuer. He was a tall man with weathered dark skin, intelligent eyes, and calloused hands that spoke of years of hard labor. His clothes were simple but well-maintained, and he carried himself with quiet dignity despite the dangerous circumstances. "My name is Elijah Walker," he said, removing his hat to reveal graying hair. "I was born into slavery in Georgia, but the war set me free. I came west looking for a new life, just like your brother Samuel." Ruby stared at him in amazement. "You knew Samuel? You know where he is?" Elijah nodded gravely as he lit a small oil lamp that cast dancing shadows on the mine walls. "Samuel and I worked together on the railroad construction crew for several months before his arrest. He was a good man, honest and hardworking. He often spoke of his sister Ruby, who lived back in Texas. Then, he could never have stolen that horse," Ruby said, her voice filled with desperate hope. "I know more than that," Elijah replied, reaching into his coat to pull out a leather pouch. "I know who really stole William Stone, the stallion, and I have proof of the corruption that sent your brother to prison." He opened the pouch and spread several documents on a wooden crate. Ruby leaned closer to examine them by lamplight. There were letters, receipts, and what appeared to be witness statements written in different handwriting. "Stone, his own son Marcus took that horse," Elijah explained, pointing to a crumpled letter. "He lost it in a card game to a gambler passing through town. Stone was furious but could not bear the shame of admitting his son was a thief and a fool. So he paid Sheriff Davies and Judge Webster to find a scapegoat." Ruby felt anger and hope warring in her chest. "Why did they choose Samuel?" "Because he was convenient," Elijah said bitterly. "A stranger with dark skin and no friends to defend him. They thought no one would ever question his conviction or come looking for the truth." "But you have been watching and gathering evidence all this time," Ruby realized. Elijah smiled grimly. "Someone had to seek justice for Samuel. I just never expected his brave sister to arrive and stir up so much trouble." As darkness fell over Red Rock, Elijah and Ruby prepared for their most dangerous mission yet. They needed to retrieve additional evidence from the home of Arthur Richardson, the town banker who had helped finance the conspiracy against Samuel. "Richardson keeps detailed records of all his transactions," Elijah explained as they crept through the shadows toward the wealthy part of town. "If we can find his ledger books, we will have proof of the money that changed hands to buy false testimony." The banker's house stood like a fortress among carefully tended gardens, its windows glowing with warm lamplight. Elijah had observed Richardson, his habits for weeks, and knew the man always retired to his study after dinner to work on his financial records. They waited until the house grew quiet, then carefully approached a side window that Elijah had previously discovered was often left unlocked. Ruby held her breath as he slowly pushed it open, listening for any sounds from within. The study was filled with expensive furniture and shelves lined with leather-bound books. Richardson's massive oak desk dominated the room, its surface covered with papers and account ledgers. Elijah moved like a ghost, his practiced hands quickly locating the records they needed. "Here," he whispered, showing Ruby a page filled with careful handwriting. "Payment to Davies for services rendered. Payment to Webster for legal consultation. Payment to Stone Ranch Hands for witness testimony." Ruby felt sick as she read the amounts. Her brother's freedom had been bought and sold like cattle at market. She began copying the most important details into her notebook when they heard heavy footsteps in the hallway outside. "Someone is coming," Elijah hissed, quickly closing the ledger and moving toward the window. But it was too late. The door burst open and Richardson, his night watchman, stood there with a lantern in one hand and a pistol in the other. His eyes widened in shock as he saw the two intruders. "Thieves! Burglars!" he shouted at the top of his lungs. "Help! Help!" Church bells began ringing throughout the town as Ruby and Elijah scrambled through the window into the night. Behind them, they could hear Richardson, his angry voice joining the alarm, and the sound of horses being saddled for pursuit. The thundering hoofbeats grew louder behind them as Ruby and Elijah ran desperately through the moonlit desert. Sheriff Davies led a posse of 12 mounted men, their torches creating dancing shadows across the rocky landscape. The sound of barking bloodhounds added to the terrifying symphony of pursuit. "This way," Elijah gasped, pulling Ruby toward a cluster of red rocks that rose from the desert floor like ancient monuments. "We can lose them in the canyon." But their pursuers knew the territory well. As dawn broke over the horizon, Ruby and Elijah found themselves trapped beside the rushing waters of Red River. The canyon walls rose steep and treacherous on both sides, offering no escape route. Sheriff Davies and his men formed a semicircle around them, their horses snorting and stamping impatiently. The sheriff dismounted slowly, his hand resting on the grip of his revolver. Well, Davies said with a cruel smile. The troublemaker and her accomplice. You have caused quite a disturbance in our peaceful town. Mayor Harrison rode up on his bay stallion, his face red with anger and exertion. Where are the documents you stole from Richardson's house? He demanded. Elijah stepped protectively in front of Ruby, his jaw set with determination. We took nothing that did not belong to the people of this territory. The evidence of your corruption will reach the federal authorities. I think not, Davies replied, drawing his pistol. In the confusion that followed, one of the deputies struck Elijah across the skull with the heavy wooden stock of his rifle. Ruby screamed as her friend collapsed to the rocky ground, blood flowing from a deep gash on his forehead. Elijah, she cried, dropping to her knees beside his motionless form. Davies grabbed her roughly by the arm, hauling her to her feet. Your friend will not be helping anyone anymore. As for you, we have a special cell waiting back in town. As they tied her hands and loaded her onto a horse, Ruby looked back at Elijah, the still form lying beside the river. She prayed desperately that he was only unconscious, not dead, but she could see no signs of life. Back in the present time, Ruby lay shivering on the cold stone floor of her cell, her body racked with hunger and despair. The guards had taken away even her thin blanket as punishment for her escape attempt, leaving her with nothing but the torn remnants of her dress to protect her from the desert night, this bitter chill. For weeks now, they had given her only stale bread and dirty water once each day. Her stomach cramped constantly, and she had grown so weak that standing required tremendous effort. The rats that shared her cell had grown bold, sometimes running across her feet in the darkness. Guard Captain Morrison took particular pleasure in her suffering. Every morning he would stop at her cell to deliver cruel taunts and threats. Your friend Elijah is dead, he would say with a vicious grin. We left his body for the buzzards beside Red River. Nobody will ever come to help you now. Ruby tried not to believe him, but as the days passed without any sign of rescue, hope began to fade from her heart like water from a cracked vessel. She found herself thinking more and more about Samuel, wondering if he was still alive somewhere on the railroad construction site, or if he too had succumbed to the brutal conditions. The other prisoners in nearby cells whispered stories of men who had simply disappeared, their bodies buried in unmarked graves in the desert. She began to understand that Mayor Harrison and his corrupt associates would never allow her to leave Red Rock alive. She knew too much about their crimes. At night, when the guards were drinking in the front office, Ruby would press her face against the small barred window and look up at the stars. She remembered her mother teaching her the constellations when she was a little girl, back when the world seemed full of possibilities instead of cruelty. Please, she whispered to the darkness, if there is any justice left in this world, let someone find the truth about Samuel. Let his name be cleared even if I do not live to see it. The wind whistled through the bars, carrying with it the scent of sage and distant rain. Ruby closed her eyes and tried to remember what freedom felt like. Miles away from Red Rock, in a hidden cave overlooking the desert, Elijah Walker slowly opened his eyes. His head throbbed with excruciating pain, and dried blood covered the left side of his face. For 3 days he had drifted in and out of consciousness, surviving only on rainwater that had collected in rock pools. The blow from the deputy's rifle had cracked his skull but had not killed him. When he finally regained enough strength to move, Elijah crawled deeper into the cave system and discovered something remarkable. The caves were connected to an old network of tunnels that had been carved by Apache warriors decades earlier during their battles with the cavalry. Using his mining experience from his days working silver claims, Elijah began to map the underground passages. To his amazement, one tunnel led directly beneath the town of Red Rock, emerging near the foundation of the old jail where Ruby was being held prisoner. Working only during the darkest hours of night, Elijah used an old pickaxe in his bare hands to widen the tunnel. His fingers bled from clawing at the rocky soil, but he pressed on with desperate determination. Every night he dug closer to Ruby, measuring his progress by counting his steps in the cramped underground passage. The work was backbreaking and dangerous. Twice the tunnel nearly collapsed on him, forcing him to shore up the walls with wooden beams scavenged from abandoned mine shafts. He lived on desert plants, rainwater, and the occasional rabbit he could catch with snares made from his bootlaces. After 2 weeks of relentless digging, Elijah finally heard something that made his heart race with hope. Through the rock wall, he could hear the faint sound of someone crying softly. It was Ruby, and she was still alive. He pressed his ear against the stone and whispered as loudly as he dared, "Ruby, can you hear me? It is Elijah. I am coming to get you out of there." For a moment there was only silence. Then he heard her voice, weak but unmistakable, respond through the wall. "Elijah, is it really you? They told me you were dead." "I am very much alive," he replied, his voice choked with emotion. "Stay strong. I will have you free very soon." Working with renewed energy, Elijah began the final phase of his rescue plan. 3 nights later, during the darkest hour before dawn, Ruby heard the soft scraping sounds coming from beneath her cell floor. She had been listening for hours, her heart pounding with anticipation and fear that the guards might discover what was happening. Suddenly, a section of the stone floor shifted and lifted upward. Elijah's dirt-covered face appeared in the opening, illuminated by a small candle he carried. His eyes were filled with relief and determination as he reached up to help her down into the narrow tunnel. "Can you walk?" he whispered urgently, seeing how weak and thin she had become during her imprisonment. Ruby tried to stand, but her legs trembled violently from weeks of malnutrition and confinement. "I am not sure," she admitted, ashamed of her weakness. Without hesitation, Elijah climbed up into the cell and gently lifted her in his strong arms. "Then I will carry you to safety," he said softly. The journey through the underground passage was a nightmare of cramped spaces and absolute darkness. Ruby clung to Elijah's neck as he crawled and stumbled through the tunnel, sometimes having to turn sideways to fit through the narrowest sections. The candle flickered dangerously in the stale air, threatening to leave them lost in complete blackness. After what felt like hours, they finally emerged from a hidden opening among the red rocks 2 miles outside of town. Ruby gasped as she felt fresh desert air fill her lungs for the first time in weeks. The stars above looked like diamonds scattered across black velvet. Elijah carried her to a sheltered cave where he had prepared a small camp with blankets, food, and medical supplies. He had even managed to find some clean clothes that would fit her. Ruby wept with gratitude as he gently helped her wash the dirt and despair from her face and hands. "You saved my life," she whispered as he wrapped a warm blanket around her shoulders. "You saved mine too," Elijah replied, his voice filled with emotion. "You gave me something worth fighting for again." For the first time in months, Ruby felt hope returning to her heart. She was free, and she was not alone in her struggle for justice. During the following weeks in their mountain hideaway, Ruby slowly regained her strength under Elijah's gentle care. He prepared nourishing broths from wild plants and hunted small game to help restore her health. As her body healed, Ruby found herself studying this remarkable man who had risked everything to save her life. Elijah possessed a quiet dignity and intelligence that impressed her deeply. Despite the hardships he had endured as a slave and the cruelty he had witnessed in Red Rock, his spirit remained unbroken. In the evenings, as they sat by their small campfire, he would tell her stories of his childhood in Georgia and his dreams of building a better life in the territories. "I never expected to find someone who would fight so hard for justice," Elijah said one night as they looked up at the star-filled sky. "Most people accept injustice as part of life, but you refuse to surrender." Ruby felt her heart stirring with emotions she had never experienced before. "I could not have continued without your help. You showed me that I was not alone in believing that right and wrong still matter in this world." As the days passed, their friendship deepened into something more profound. They found themselves talking for hours about their hopes, fears, and dreams for the future. Ruby discovered that beneath Elijah's strong exterior was a gentle soul who had maintained his faith in humanity despite experiencing its worst cruelties. Together, they carefully organized all the evidence they had gathered against the corrupt officials of Red Rock. They had Richardson's financial records, witness statements, and documentation of the conspiracy that had sent Samuel to prison. But they both knew that presenting this evidence locally would be useless as long as Harrison controlled the town. "We need to get this information to the federal authorities," Elijah said as they studied the documents by candlelight. "There is a territorial marshal named Thomas McLeod who has a reputation for honesty and courage." "How do we reach him without being captured?" Ruby asked. Elijah smiled and took her hand gently in his, very carefully, and together. "Whatever happens, we face it as partners." Ruby squeezed his hand, feeling strength flow between them. For the first time since arriving in Red Rock, she believed that justice might actually be possible. 2 weeks later, the morning sun cast long shadows across Red Rock as a lone rider approached the town limits. Federal Marshal Thomas McLeod was a tall, weathered man with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen too much injustice in his 30 years of law enforcement. His badge gleamed silver on his black vest, and his reputation for honesty preceded him throughout the territories. Mayor Harrison greeted the marshal with forced enthusiasm, clearly nervous about this unexpected visit from federal authority. "Marshal McLeod, what brings you to our humble town? I hope there are no problems requiring your attention." "Just a routine inspection of territorial law enforcement," McLeod replied calmly, his sharp eyes taking in every detail of the town, South Main Street. "I have received some interesting correspondence regarding legal proceedings in Red Rock." What Harrison did not know was that Ruby and Elijah had successfully contacted the marshal through Father McKenna, who had secretly carried their evidence to the territorial capital. The old priest had risked his own safety to ensure that justice would finally be served. That evening, McLeod met with Ruby and Elijah in the abandoned mine where their story had begun. By lamplight, they presented him with every piece of evidence they had gathered: Richardson's financial records showing payments for false testimony, witness statements proving Samuel's innocence, and documentation of the conspiracy involving Harrison, Davies, Judge Webster, and William Stone. "This is more than sufficient evidence to warrant federal intervention," McLeod said after carefully examining each document. "The corruption in this town runs deeper than I initially suspected." The next morning, McLeod returned to Red Rock with a federal warrant and a company of territorial rangers. The arrest began at dawn. Sheriff Davies was taken from his bed in iron shackles. Judge Webster was apprehended while trying to flee town on horseback. Banker Richardson was found hiding in his vault, surrounded by bags of gold coins he had planned to take with him. Mayor Harrison made one last desperate attempt to maintain his authority. "You have no jurisdiction here, Marshal. This is a local matter." "Corruption of federal law is always a federal matter," McLeod replied as the Rangers placed Harrison under arrest. "Your reign of terror in Red Rock is finished." Within hours, the truth about Samuel's false conviction spread throughout the town. William Stone, faced with federal charges, finally confessed that his son Marcus had stolen and lost the horse in a gambling debt. 1 year later, the autumn sun painted the Arizona landscape in shades of gold and crimson as a familiar figure walked slowly down the dusty road toward Red Rock. Samuel Johnson was thinner than before his imprisonment, his face marked by months of hard labor under the desert sun. But his eyes held the same gentle spirit that Ruby remembered from their childhood. Ruby ran to meet him, tears streaming down her face as she embraced the brother she had fought so hard to save. Samuel held her close, marveling at how much stronger and more determined she had become during their time apart. "I never stopped believing you would find a way to prove my innocence," Samuel whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Even in the darkest moments on that railroad crew, I knew my sister would never give up on me." Elijah approached them with a warm smile, extending his hand to Samuel in friendship and respect. The two men had corresponded during Samuel's final months of imprisonment, and Samuel already considered Elijah to be the brother he had never had. The town of Red Rock had changed dramatically since the corruption trials. Marshal McLeod had appointed honest officials to replace those who had been arrested, and the community was slowly learning to treat all people with dignity and respect. Father McKenna had organized committees to help former prisoners reintegrate into society and find honest work. On a crisp October morning, Ruby and Elijah stood together before Father McKenna in the small wooden church where Ruby had first learned the truth about Samuel's false conviction. The church was filled with friends and well-wishers, including several former prisoners who had been freed when the corruption was exposed. Ruby wore a simple white dress that Elijah had carefully chosen for her, and he stood beside her in his best suit, his face radiating happiness and hope for their future together. Samuel served as witness to their union, proud to see his sister find love with such a good and honorable man. After the ceremony, the three of them purchased a small farm in a neighboring territory where they could start fresh, far from the painful memories of Red Rock. Samuel tended the crops while Ruby and Elijah raised horses and built the peaceful life they had dreamed of during those dark days in the mountains. Justice had finally prevailed, and love had conquered the hatred that once seemed so powerful.